Welcome to Vault Festival and to our season of talks, panels and new writing. It's called XR, Decolonise, Decarbonise. And today we will be discussing this point on the wall, police lovebombing, how it feels when we hear you singing police praises. So the whole point of this series of talks is to open up conversations with marginalised people, people from minority communities, people who have felt unloved by XR in the past, and just to have conversations. We're not here, this isn't an exercise in self-flagellation. At the same time, it's not about XR defending itself. It really is just about starting that really important conversation. One of our panelists from unforeseen circumstances was not able to make it today, which is a real shame because I had really wanted his voice on this panel. So I'm going to read out some excerpts from an article that he wrote that was published in The Guardian in October. The panelist who wasn't able to make it is called Athian Akec, and he is a really incredible young man, actually, 17-year-old knife crime, Brexit and climate campaigner from Camden. And he's spoken in Parliament, and I think he has some really important things to say. So just some little bits from his article. The tactics of Extinction Rebellion are designed by and for middle-class white Britain. Their central rhetoric about a dystopian future fails to cut through for those of us already faced with a nightmarish present, surrounded by poverty and austerity. Meanwhile, the tactic of being purposely arrested strikes an uncomfortable note for many people of colour, given the adverse experiences people in my community have had with the police. The climate movement's failure to stand in solidarity with our political struggles adds to this sense of disconnect. Athian says, "My friends and I are not politically switched off, but what we engage with is the here and now. The luxury of thinking far into the future is not one afforded to us. We are still the punchbag of the 2008 financial crisis and have borne the brunt of a decade of austerity, neoliberal economics, and the gradual erosion of social security. In addition to all this, with seemingly monthly Snapchat eulogies to peers lost to knife crime, it's easy to see how the Extinction Rebellion protests are merely white noise for us." He goes on to say, "One friend of mine was stop and searched by the police 12 times last year. When I told him that the Extinction Rebellion protesters were purposefully getting themselves arrested, he rolled his eyes in sheer irritation. That's not an option for black people, he said, adding that if he was arrested, the police would undoubtedly treat him differently and his future career prospects might also be destroyed. The tactic of deliberately seeking arrest has further alienated disenfranchised communities like mine, who across generations have had bad experiences with the police." Athian says, "For people like my friends and me to safely protest, Extinction Rebellion needs to reform its tactics by actively reaching out to young black and brown people and showing it truly understands the grave challenges we face." I think he's an extraordinary young man, and well done him for writing that. It can't have been easy. Extinction Rebellion we're huge, we have a massive platform, and I really wanted to be able to give some of that platform to him, so it's a real shame that he wasn't here today, but I feel his voice is in the room now anyway. I'm going to pass on now to Daze from Extinction Rebellion Youth, who's going to be chairing this discussion.
Hi, I'm Daze. I'm from Extinction Rebellion Youth. And this is why it's so important to us to be here, to make sure that we actually start talking about climate justice and how best we can start relating with the world that surrounds us. Mothiur, would you like to start? Mothiur is coordinator for XR Muslims.
Hi, pleasure. Great to be here on this panel. I'm with XR Muslims, but I started in the political strategy team in September 2018, leading up to the April Rebellion, and then after that is when I joined XR Muslims. And it's interesting to see these different perspectives from being in the political strategy team, leading the April Rebellion, part of that core strategy team, and then on the side, now on the margins in XR Muslims in this border space. And also then, when the comments came from Roger after the Canning Town incident, a few people of colour came together to write a letter that was an internal compassionate critique of some of the elements of XR that was actually I was beginning to feel quite strongly about. and still feel. And I feel both sides of like this desire, compassion, this commitment to the movement, but also seeing aspects of it that need to change in some way. And this conversation is going to be a great way to open into that.
Thank you. And here is Kevin from Netpol. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Kevin Blowe. I am the coordinator of an organisation called the Network for Police Monitoring, normally known as Netpol, because that's a bit of a mouthful. Includes a number of organisations, including Green and Black Cross, who put out legal observers at protests and demonstrations. I've been an activist for a very long time. A lot of that was in East London, in the borough of Newham, where I was an activist for a black-led anti-racist and police monitoring group called the Newham Monitoring Project for the best part of 25 years. And I've been involved in Netpol since it started 10 years ago. And from the late 90s up until 2009, I was the secretary for a group called the United Families and Friends Campaign, which brings together the relatives of people who die in police custody in prison. I should emphasise that secretary sounds like it's an important job, and I'm not an important person at all. This was literally a administrative and organiser's role. It was about using those particular set of skills to allow those families to be able to have a voice. And I guess we'll go on to the reasons why we're all here, but I mean, for me, some of you may be aware that during the October Rebellion, there was a number of criticisms of Exile, but then one in particular was about the laying of flowers and a thank you, and leaving of a thank you note at Brixton Police Station, which for Netpol and for me personally, because I was spending most of my time during those weeks just talking to people as they were coming out of police stations and trying to help them with sort of this is what happens next, because they weren't getting the information, was a kind of a kick in the stomach for reasons that I guess I'll go on to explain later on. But I certainly would much rather that I don't speak a lot and that you ask questions, because I think that's much more better way of kind of drawing out some of these issues.
Thank you so much. And that kind of goes on to where I thought we would go next, which is because this question, I think, is so controversial, mainly because people come from it from a very personal place. So I want to ask you, Mothiur, how can you relate to this question? Where are you coming from in relation to love bombing the police?
I actually was born in a community in Leeds called Beeston, where you might have heard of it, was where 2 of the 7/7 bombers were from. They went to my school. My cousins were actually living on the same street as Sadiq Khan. So the community, this whole issue that comes around states, around marginalisation and the anger, the frustration, all these really strong emotions, and then how the state responds, and we're seeing it within with the sort of the disobedience and that movement of that XR and how we should, how do we transform that relationship to the police? We have to keep finding different ways to respond than just with more anger. I guess I see love as having both of these kind of concepts in it. It can be seen as if you're just condoning the police, but it can also be a symbol of radical love, or love that is actually requiring and demanding a different response, but through peaceful means. That word itself has it already a judgment inside it, I guess. But yeah, that's where I'm coming from. That love bombing or love itself can have different means to it and different ways of responding. It could be about how you yourself feel about your position in society, as much as about the police themselves.
Yeah, I think it'll be quite interesting to come to you, Kevin, and I'm not going to go as a white male, but how has your relationship with the police changed since working with Netpol?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, the kind of attitude towards the police wasn't developed through the work that I do for Netpol. I mean, most of the time that the work that I've done has very little to do with protest at all, which is the main work we do now. Most of it has been about young kids, mainly Black Caribbean kids, being stopped and searched, being beaten up, over the course of a period from about 1990 onwards. And I don't love the police, and I'm completely unapologetic about the fact that I don't love them. It's not the same. You don't have to choose one or the other, either love or hate. I guess I don't actually think there's anything particularly wrong with being angry about the way that the police treat communities up and down the country at all. Being really angry about it. The subject of this discussion is about love bombing. It's not about loving the police. It's about the tactic of publicly demonstrating your making a statement of saying we love you too. And as I said, I mean, usually an organisation like Netpol would kind of a step away from getting involved into the internal discussions of a movement. And it just was, for me particularly, just the moment when, having seen all this happen and kind of bitten your tongue and thought, this is just grating, this is just actually offensive. But there are people that need support. There are disabled activists from XR are being treated appallingly as well by the police right now. So I'm not going to say anything. And the thing about what happened at the Brixton police station, to a certain extent you could say, well, it's a one-off, right? It doesn't really matter. It's just one idiot, if you think, as I do, that there's something fundamentally wrong with that. But it wasn't just what happened, it was the reaction to it that I think was the concern, because what it tended to point to was the fact that people didn't see there's anything wrong with this. That actually the flip side of that is that people did see that there was something wrong with being angry, very angry about the treatment of the state of significant numbers of people on the basis of the colour of their skin. And I'm not a member of XR, but provide the solidarities and support that you need, that I think everybody should do, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything. But it makes it more difficult for that solidarity to happen, and it makes it more difficult for people to join if you don't address those issues, which is the reason why, when this invitation came, I decided to come along today.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I've kind of had a mix of upbringing. I grew up in Tottenham. I lived on White Hart Lane for most of my life. And then I actually grew up in Lincolnshire. And in Lincolnshire, it's very much in the same way that XR loves the police in that way. In Lincolnshire, it's the same way. But in places like Tottenham, where I grew up, it's the police are someone you're scared of, and the police are someone that you stay away from. So even me, in almost like finding my relationship and where I sit within XR, it's been a little bit difficult because of those kind of attitudes as well. But I kind of want to come towards, like, I think the really big event that you keep mentioning of if you didn't see it, essentially some of the protesters who were arrested at Brixton police station sent flowers and a thank you note after their arrest. I want to ask Mothiur, how do you feel about that? Because I could hear your sigh.
I mean, I was arrested in the October Rebellion, and it's funny, my relationship with the police, as I was being arrested, I've not been arrested before, and there's something about this collective witnessing that was going on at the same time when there's hundreds of people around you, and it's kind of almost like a performance, that you're in this performance of this arrest, which is probably a very radically different experience when people are in the middle of the night walking in the street and a policeman comes up to you and says, can you, I want to search you or something, and then you start getting to this fearful position, I'm on my own. When you're around, how does that change your relationship? With the actual incident of sending the flag, I think that's disrespectful in many ways as well. Like, the police have got a job to do and they're doing their job, and to send flowers, it's showing a naivety in the person who's sending the flowers, but that doesn't mean as Kevin was saying, that one incident is that it's about the strategy of love bombing as well, but what does that mean of trying to, and I think you need to think about all these different things, because a lot of energy has gone into that one incident, and many of media channels have then responded who do want to also break XR, you could say, and there are also other organisations that want to break XR, and you can use that one incident to start putting a lot of pressure on. But what about all the other hundreds and thousands or hundreds of experiences that are there that of protesters who've been arrested, and there's a story there as well. Like with the judge, for example, as well, like coming out and saying, Judge Noble, who was saying, that this is a profound thing that XR needs to win. It's changing institutional stories, which is also important.
Can I? So I don't want to dominate this, and I really do want to let other people speak. But can I just? You mentioned the judgment that this is. People may not be aware of this. This is the in the court case where John Noble, who's the judge, had said that he really respected what Extinction Rebellion, how principled they were, and he expected them to be a bunch of anarchists and troublemakers. And you see that as a good thing, and I see that as absolutely terrible, because he puts me in the camp as the anarchists and troublemakers. That somehow it's justified to be able to crack down and have longer sentences and see as being somehow more deserving of punishment. And that, for me, is the reason why I think a lot of people saw what happened with the flowers at Brixton as not being just a one-off, or not just even being the big thing, but being symptomatic of something bigger. So it's people's reaction to something like that is the test of a movement, if you like. So if some people reacted to, for instance, what happened in Brixton by saying, why do you always have to bring up skin colour? And I'm not prepared to debate with those people, because frankly, I've had 30 years of having to deal with racists, and I'm not really interested in pursuing somebody who insists on saying that colour blindness is actually a thing. It's not. It's a denial of people's experiences. There are some people who whose response was, well, it happened a long time ago. And I'm more than happy to have a discussion with people like that, because that's just a naivety about, or understanding about the police's role and the state's role in oppressing protests and oppressing, in general, its role of being on the side of the state. The third one, I think, I found the more difficult one, and this fits into the judge's comments, which is, but it is about wanting to be praised by the state, if you like. So this idea that you need to get the police on board is a strategic one. It's that idea, there is within the theory of change that XR pushes, there is this idea that, about winning the police and other institutions of the state over. Now, I have a problem with that, but I'm not going to, there's a very big discussion. But what it poses a question: why is it that it appears that is more important than winning over allies, particularly allies from people who may be nervous about getting involved because of their relationship to the state? Why do you see it as being more important to win over an individual police officer than by accepting that that there are a lot of people who find that whole debate and conversation incredibly problematic and difficult? Now, that's not a question for you, it's a question for the entire movement. Why is that seen as a greater priority than being more inclusive? And for me, it comes down to that I don't think that movements like XR, and this is not exclusively XR, because it's not like XR's the bad guys and everybody else is perfect. Practically everybody I work with has got to take a long, hard stare at some of the shit they get up to, frankly. But it is about saying, if we're going to be serious about addressing the issues around diversity, why are we so obsessed with trying to get the police on board? And I don't know the answer to that question. Actually, I've got a conference coming up at the end of March, Movement of Movements conference. I guess that will be one of the discussions that will come up for there, because it's not about whether you love the police. It's about what is your relationship to the state. And I don't think that there's been a serious discussion about that within XR, because so much has happened so quickly, but it needs to happen soon.
I think that kind of sums up the way I see this question as well, in the same way that within XR, I think there is this moment of there are the people who work for the police and there is the institution of the police, and people don't see you different within that. And I think, like, for example, from Kevin's point of view, you might see like a difference between people who work as police officers but also the institution. But I don't think a lot of people in XR sees that differentiate.
Yeah, I don't really care about it. Somebody is a police officer. That doesn't automatically make them an evil person. But when they put on a uniform and go out and are involved in not just in beating somebody up, but part of an institution that is designed to pick on particular sections of society, it's the institution you have a problem with. It's not about the individuals, right? And it's thinking about how you address that institution that I think is the more important thing. Once you get trapped into the idea is that they've got children and families too, you're missing the bigger pictures. Guess what I'm trying to say?
This letter that we wrote, just as a paragraph, just talks about structural inequalities and that this institutions in the society that we live in have grown. And value in principle 7, which is about mitigating its power, we said, we have to recognise that we come from a society that is built on structural inequality and oppression, and that as UK citizens we are taught a history that does not reflect this appropriately. And that's the key. We're not taught about this. I wasn't taught about this, at school either. And so, as growing up as a person of colour, I'm actually trying to invisibilise my colour most of my life. I was trying to say, I want to become a lawyer. I want to do this. I don't want constantly to have my colour put into my face that I'm different. But since Brexit, since this, there's a big shift for me going on. That actually, I'm seeing a much more that if we don't step into this space, then but with not to say that we're in. There's a space because of the climate breakdown that is breaking the institutions up. That is, the whole modernity, the whole project itself is that civilizational project is breaking up. And how can we step into that space as it's break up with a different story? And for me, that this love bombing it's a theory, and it's being tested, and it's being tested really radically and really strongly, and we're having different opinions about it, but we are trying to do something different and not do the same habitual way. And for me, I think that takes courage to try to do something different. But listening, XR is having problems with listening in some parts because it's got into a very defensive position, and that position of defensiveness is creating an incapacity to listen as well as it could.
Yeah, and I think we start talking about almost like solutions. As in, Kevin, what would you think would be the best way that XR can start relating with institutions like the police?
Well, I don't think you need to have a relationship with the police. I think you need to have a strategy for how you deal with policing in the same way that you have a strategy for dealing with anything else. But I mean, certainly there are reasons why you may want to have a conversation with the police in a town somewhere outside of London if you're organising a protest. But the reason for doing that is to protect your people, is to make sure that there's somebody who's speaking to a senior officer who is be able to say, hang on a second, this is completely disproportionate, this is out of control. I'm not sure that I agree with the kind of prescription, if you like, or the thing that's often said. The solution to this is that the XR or another movement, let's say XR needs to listen to more people from racialised communities or people of colour, because listening's not enough. It's what you do then. It's what you act upon with this information. That actually, I've been to listening exercises both for XR and for previous movements where there's an awful lot of listening and not an awful lot of doing that follows up after that, and so the judgment on this, I'll come back to this, the judgment on this is what happens next. When the listening's happened, what changes? If people are saying this radical experiment in love bombing is actually driving people away from your movement, is complicating the legal support in terms of opening a space for increased surveillance on process as a whole, what are you going to do about it? And your answer is, well, we've listened, but we're not really going to change anything. Then what was the point of asking the question in the first place, I guess, is one thing. And I think that's why continuing to have those discussions is really important. So that's negative. On the positive, I do think that that I think it would be really useful for XR to think about deepening in its understanding of its theory of change. So, because I think sometimes there is a misunderstanding, right? So I can accept, without necessarily agreeing, the idea that you reach a critical mass where the police decide that they no longer have public consent for the type of policing that they do, and enormous pressure applies to the police, right? But having some understanding that this is the second most hierarchical organisation in public life after the army, that those decisions are going to be made at a senior level, and chatting with and being super friendly with an individual police officer makes no difference whatsoever, but is likely to not endear you to other people, it's a strategic decision. You know, you don't have to do it. It's when I was at both of the XR protests, and they were inspiring in many ways. And the bits that were not tended to be the stuff that I'm talking about now. The bits that were great was that boat at Oxford Circus. That was awesome, you know, particularly for somebody who's not seen something like that for a while. That kind of level of creativity and energy, and it poses the question: well, maybe rethinking the why the state is important, because of the broader issues around climate justice, the understanding that the state is there to support capitalism, that all those things should be up for debate as well as part of this thing. And I think it doesn't sort of lend itself to easy solutions for any of this stuff. But I actually would be really interested to see what other people think about this.
Can I just respond to that, because you said something around you're not interested in or it's not important to have a relationship with the police. I think differentiating between the state interest and the public interest, that's becoming more and more important, that the police, not necessarily just the state, that they have their own they have to look after the public interest. And we met up with...
I disagree with that.
Well, it's becoming more and more clear that the state has its own kind of... Like, there was a report, I think...
The police are the state.
Well, this is where there is a slight difference. So we met up with the Prevent police. The police which was the chief superintendent of Prevent, because they were inviting us to see whether or not, to give reassurance both around the extremist labelling that XR has. I'm saying this publicly so that we have more transparency around this, because I think it's important, because you have the MO6, who were the Met police who were doing the actions. We had a relationship, first of all, of no surprise and for the April Rebellion, which led to the police having to balance the responsibility towards exercising the right to protest safely, and also trying to keep public order, which led to no police officer being assaulted. During this whole sort of arrest, people were holding that line very clearly. And then in the October Rebellion, there was a shift in the political, in the Home Office's kind of way of wanting to respond to the police, but much more strongly. They were not actually being transparent about and saying what they were going to do. So that led to a much more heavy-handed policing. And so when we actually were at the police, the counter-terrorism policing, we were saying, actually, what is happening by the MO6, which are the Metropolitan Police, their change and their shift in their relationship is actually radicalising lots of people, because young people are feeling the eco-anxiety. They've had a Section 14 put over them, as if their anxiety doesn't really matter. And that has led to their anxiety not being given a space to be expressed, whether through public protests. And they went back with a question themselves, the counter-terrorism policing unit, thinking, actually, is that response by the police, the MOC, is that the right response to be having, if it's actually increasing the possibility of vulnerable people moving more towards extremism? So,
I can see Kevin is
yes.
a little bit irritated by some of the things. Do you want to share?
This is about you would have seen the news in January about Extinction Rebellion appearing on a list of alleged domestic extremists. I am frankly astonished that people met with the Prevent people, because XR's legal team knows perfectly well that this is an issue that Netpol, we've been working with them intensely over the last 18 months, it's been working on for 10 years. It's not a question of going and meeting people from Prevent in order to be able to convince them to change their mind. This is a unit that's utterly obsessed with finding extremists under every bed, and just going to see them is throwing a whole lot of other people under the bus. And I'm just flabbergasted that happened. I am absolutely stunned that the XR took that decision to do that. It is just another example of the staggering levels of naivety and ignorance.
Just in response to that, I did go and see Cage, who've been doing a lot of work around Prevent from the Muslim perspective.
Going to see another people doesn't make it all right.
I think.
No, but I'm just trying to say that.
I think it would be great to round it up and get some questions. Yeah.
My name's Ali. I'm going to be in the next talk, but the October Rebellion, just to put it in context, I was part of a group of people running a site, the Global Justice Rebellion site, that was specifically not focused on arrests. And one of the things I think was coming up in that last thing that you were talking about and really, really concerns me is not only do I feel like the overt love bombing is disrespectful, but what isn't acknowledged is it's putting people actively in danger. So the site I was on had undocumented migrants, people of the trans community, like, including myself, have had unhelpful relationships with the police, people from other communities that have been actively targeted by the police, which is why we wanted it to be largely unarrestable. And a group of people from other XR groups were standing outside singing "We Love You" at the police and asking them to come and talk to them. So we went and said, do you mind moving elsewhere? Because there are people who are at risk if you are stood with these police officers while they're on this site. And they were like, no, because we want them to join us. And it was not understanding that we'd made a safe space for people and they were making it unsafe. And also things like drawing attention to people, saying things like, well, you can't cover your face. But if you're an undocumented migrant or someone that has had issues with saying, well, you can't come to an XR post and cover your face. I've got friends who are on lists and have been targeted and have had information given and leaked to the media, who have had targets on their families, particularly people of colour who've been much less involved in the protests that they were involved in than some of their white colleagues. But, and saying that you have to sign a thing, you have to give your name, and you have to put, if you do certain things with XR, you have to give your information. And inviting people to and giving people information that puts people at risk. And I'll shut up in a minute. But the final example is, as I was talking to Roger the other week, where he was on a video, and he talks about telling the truth. But he said on the video, I think if you're a person of colour and you're arrested, it's not as bad as you think. I think you'll probably be treated the same as anybody else. So it's like, that is factually incorrect. And also anyone who takes that at face value, and the sort of people that might take, someone who has not had that bad experience yet, is at risk. So it's not just the disrespect. For me and for the other activist communities that I've worked in, it's the physical, life-changing risk that people are being put under.
No, thank you for touching upon that, because it just speaks to the naivety, and I think that's a large part of the conversation that we've had today. It's that level of naivety that people may have. Would you?
At the start, when you first kind of focusing on the question of like how it feels, I feel like you weren't given a massive opportunity to kind of discuss your experience of being a woman of colour involved in XR in those sites, and what the experience is for you, in those situations. And if you want to talk about that, if you're comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think it is really difficult, because I think it's just kind of like, I was explaining, like my childhood, being 1 foot in Tottenham, 1 foot in Lincolnshire, and in the same way being 1 foot, as you can hear, like I am middle class and having an education, but at the same time I know that has brought me a lot of, especially when it comes to the police, I've been stopped, but I haven't been searched because I start talking, and then they're like, oh, don't worry, love, you can go on. And I think that kind of shows almost the scariness that if I had an accent like my brothers who have traditionally London accents, that it's a very different story for them. And especially when you talk about solidarity with other groups, working with XR youth, there's a lot of groups who want to work with us but won't touch XR. And it kind of hurts because we see the beauty within XR and the fact that we support and we love it. However, we do see the problems, and the lack of action does become a bit annoying, because it leads to conversations that could be had just not happening because they don't want to interact with us. And partly even, so I do climate activism outside of XR, and I was working with the Stephen Lawrence Foundation when the particular Brixton flowers happened. They actually were very open to working with XR before, and then they saw that, and obviously that was a wound that was very much tore back open. And after that, even to the extent of like ending room bookings that we had with them and not really wanting to engage in that conversation. So I think I kind of sit in the middle of where I understand how this happens. I think it's the general public not noticing the difference between the people as people in the police, but the institution that's imperialistic and racist, but at the same time, not really knowing how to fix it as well, because the solution is so big, because we have to start like re-educating people and re-socializing people to realize that the system doesn't work for all, and making them become self-aware, which I think is like the hardest thing. So yeah, I think that kind of like sums up. It's very much like in two heads about it. Mothiur, would you like to say something?
Just in response to what Ali was saying, I think that is there's something about the structural privilege of people who are just seeing the world from their perspective and then not noticing that it's that somebody else's experience can be completely different, and just thinking, no, but this is a universal experience, and that needs to be changed, and that needs to be, needs to be brought out even more. So I think that as a specific situation is something that was wrong, but yeah, the strategic I think just talking about structural privilege for me feels more powerful, because I was reading a book, and I can't remember her name now, but she was a black writer, and she's written a book, and she said she went to a Brexit or Brexit First kind of campaign, and the people were complaining about people of colour and migrants coming in, but they said to her, "But we're not talking about you, dear. We're not talking about you, love. You're okay." And she was reflecting about that afterwards, and she was like, "Is it because I'm not seen as like, it's like I'm just seen as part of you, like the middle class kind of." And I guess I come from, even though I come from a poorer background, I've kind of, my education is still from a structurally privileged position, and I think it's just about being able to see that there's so many different experiences, and we've got to take account and hear and listen to all these experiences and be able to tell the story from all those perspectives, and look at structural privilege. What does that actually, how does power dynamics come out?
Very briefly on that, and then I think it would be really useful to get some other comments from the floor. But just on that, one of the interesting things about some of the new language of some of this discussion. So when I wrote a piece about what happened in Brixton, I talked about the word microaggressions, and never really understanding what that meant. The idea that this daily kind of grinding kind of sense of, again, another racist comment, another thing, right? And of course, why would I? I am a white, middle-aged man, right? And then suddenly getting it, because it just absolutely, I thought of all the people whose homes I've sat in and whose funeral, the relatives of funerals I've attended, and the court cases and the coroner's inquests that I've been to, and it suddenly became real. And to a certain extent, the recent debate about things like understanding people's individual lived experiences are not new. We just called it something different when I was 20 years or 30 years younger than I am now. Right? So, and part of it was about saying the key thing is about making sure that those people who don't have a voice, whose voice is taken away from them by the state, by council officers, by politicians, by the newspapers and so on, are provided with the solidarity and support in order to be able to do so. And I still think that is relevant and useful to the discussions we're talking about now, because there are a lot of people who are saying there are problems with Exile's approach to this stuff, and they can't all just be people who are being critical of the movement and who are, moaners, basically. They can't all be that. There is a reason why there's that wave of people who are raising these concerns. And yet, and I don't want to go back to it again, what you've just spoken about in relation to going and meet the people from Prevent has so horrified me yet again that I'm thinking I'm not sure that anybody is listening. And it comes down to a question of priorities. What do you see as being more important? Is building XR into be genuinely representative much bigger, with groups in different places, that doesn't experience the kind of negative reaction that you've just talked about from some of the people, more important than just ploughing on with the strategy that you've got at the moment of doing something like going and meeting the police with limited returns, frankly, because they will bullshit you as much as you for all the things you want to hear, with no payback at all. It's not even good strategy. That's what I don't understand. It's not even helping to move the movement forwards. So why do it? Anyway.
Do we have more questions?
My heart's in my mouth as I'm listening to you speak, Daze, because that thing of what you're saying about feeling the beauty of the movement and then being torn as well by for me, it's a sense of shame on the things the movement fails on. And those strategical I agree, they're errors. It's really, really difficult. And I think naivety is a key word for this, because I'm representative of what XR can do, which is, I wasn't an activist and I was just getting on with my life and completely outside the movement. There was something about the way XR presented in April that just cut through everything, and I joined them because of the boat and got arrested about the same week. So it's the speed and the reach of XR which is incredible. But then the deeper I've got into XR, the more I've encountered things that just run completely counter to my beliefs. Because, professionally I work in anti-racism and decoloniality within cultural institutions, and then to discover that ingrained somewhere deep within this movement is what appears to be a feeling that talking about race, talking about decoloniality is a hard left co-option of the movement, is just totally alien to me, because conflating anti-racism with leftism for me seems like a conflation of two completely separate things, but maybe that's my own lack of understanding of political theory. I'm an amateur, I'm not a professional political theorist. In terms of looking for solutions, and this isn't a place where we'll find that, but I think a lot of what's happening in XR to me seems to be about mass mobilization in a deeply divided nation, in a nation that's deeply divided on race. And there's something about, it is supposedly a non-hierarchical movement, which means if we organize and if we form our circles and we develop our own policy, no matter how much resistance we get from other parts of the movement, we're still feeding into XR, and we're holding on to the idea that you can form a circle and you can develop your own actions. It seems to be the only way. I think maybe also it lies in localism. I think when I joined the movement in April and I was sitting on Waterloo Bridge, I was immediately noticing a very sort of countryside influenced culture meeting urban London and it not working. And there were a couple of incidents, I won't go into the details of them, but it was about the divisions between your experience of people of other races when you live in a white-dominated countryside town and when you're in London, and people just not having the ability to read or act within that situation. So it left me thinking that the XR that operates in London and the actions that operate in London have to be very different to the XR that operates regionally. And it has to be responsive to local circumstances, because I don't know if you accept that we've got less than 11 years to solve this crisis, and so you have to move so quickly and you have to be so extreme and you have to agitate in a country that is as divided as we are, whether the movement can be the same across the entire country, and we have to focus on our local circumstances. That's the only way forwards I can see.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone have anything to comment?
I totally feel that the heart of this movement is moving in a much more anti-racist way, in a much more decentralised way. The money is stuck with the power that is the bloc.
Can I just add one thing as well, just to chuck something else into the mix? We've talked quite a lot about obviously the particular thing about the interaction between policing, social movements and race. But I mean, I live in East London, in a working class part of London, and the occasionally dismissive attitude towards XR is not confined solely to my black friends. It's also to pretty much everybody, right? So, and it's not a rejection. And this is the one point I do agree with you in relation to the media. You know, there is an understanding that the media are constantly shaping the debate about what XR is. So it makes sense to portray it as a middle class, white middle class movement. I mean, which it overwhelmingly is, but it makes it easy to portray it as exclusively that, because it means that it encourages people to say this isn't for you. There's no question about that at all. I think it would be wrong to only talk about the issue around, particularly in relation to policing, about people's attitudes being confined only to black communities in this country, that would be a mistake, because where I live, everybody is stopped and searched if they're under 19. Lots of people are stopped every week. They're more likely to be, significantly more likely to be, stopped if they're young and particularly black Caribbean, but everybody stops and searched. And so their relationship with the police across the board is also based on class. That means that there's a whole wider set of people who will look at this tactic in a pretty dismissive way, and that if the solutions that you're looking for are only addressed around, well, as is our attitude towards race particularly problematic, then that's not going to be enough. It means bringing it back to what is our relationship with the police. That's, for me, is the crucial thing. It comes, what is the relationship with the state? Because if you can say what it is that you want from the police, which is non-violent tactics, we are not going to engage in what you describe as violence. The only violence that's going to be here is probably, as it is with most demonstrations, is going to come from the police themselves. But we're not going to respond to that. We will engage with you when we need to, but our main reason here is to speak to our fellow citizens, frankly. Then that changes your tactics, doesn't it? It changes your priorities, and that's what I've been trying to say, that it's a priority whether you decide to do this or not.
Two things. One is, you said that, relationship to the police, relationship to the state, and that's, you could say that's a relationship to how we, power, to state power. The other thing is how the environmental movement's grown, which is it has come from, it's often just seen as a white middle-class movement, Greenpeace and so on. You know, people have got NGOs. It's seen as a single issue. And what I think XI is beginning to do is trying to expand that and say it's not just, it's about how our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to the state, our relationships to justice, as we move into a climate breakdown situation. And that's a whole bigger issue, and it needs everybody to come in. But at the moment, it's still, most people just see, oh, it's an environmental movement, it's an environmental activist. And it's, we're just used to seeing white middle class people doing that activism. And how we change that story is really crucial. I think that's what April Rebellion brought. It brought a whole different demographic involved, and people go, oh, that's different. And it's brought new people in, but it's also causing a lot of conflict as well as it's grown. And I think XR grown really quickly over a very short period of time from having to, we're going to get co-opted by that, we've got to stick to our own story. And suddenly, it has grown, and now it has a bigger responsibility. And that shift as it's grown to its adolescence period, if you want to call that, to like how it's going to respond to those new responsibilities as it's grown, to be able to have a more of a message of equity in it and justice so it's a crucial point where we're at. And I think there are XIs trying to become more regional as well, as Ali was saying. So it's recognizing, but then it's trying to shift where power lies.
Yeah, and on that note, it's actually 4:00. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here and braving it in the rain and horrible weather outside. I think we've got so much conversation that we can take to our local groups and take to our families and have this really difficult conversation. I want to thank Kevin for being here and Mothiur as well. And thank you all. We are done.
Thank you.